This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. My guest on this episode is Dr. Elizabeth Jemison. Elizabeth Jemison is Associate Professor of Religion at Clemson University, where she teaches courses on American religion. She is the author of Christian Citizens, Reading the Bible in Black and White in the Postemancipation South, published by UNC Press in 2020. Her next book project, tentatively titled Christian Motherhood, Race and Southern Churchwomen's Organizing During Segregation, examines how women's religious groups across racial lines mobilized to defend Christian motherhood with conflicting results. At Clemson, Jemison received the Provost Outstanding Junior Teacher Award in 2022 and the College of AAH Dean's Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2020. Due to her interest in and commitment to excellence in her own teaching, but also her interests in all levels of schools and state standards, we spent a bulk of this conversation discussing her love of teaching and her observations on what gets taught in schools, who decides, and why location and states matter. We then turn our attention to her in-progress Christian Motherhood book project. As a teacher myself, this teacher talk was just a total joy for me, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Jemison. Dr. Elizabeth Jemison, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if we can start off by having you just introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
So I'm an associate professor of religion at Clemson University in South Carolina, where I teach courses on American religious history broadly. So African American religion, religion in the American South. And I really love teaching. I'm a scholar, I've written other things, but teaching has been a real passion of mine. And I love teaching Clemson students. And from that, I've increasingly engaged with talking to congregations in the area, in other parts, not necessarily where I live, but people who've invited me in to talk to them. And I really love thinking about what it means to think about American religious history in the past, but particularly how that relates to our present. And how can we do that in ways, thinking about the past, that is, in open and generous ways that generate discussion and learning, and not just sort of sound bites for one particular political goal or another one.
Wonderful. I'm wondering how you got interested in teaching in general, because I know that you're super committed to pedagogy and the practice of teaching, but what is it about this profession that kind of drew you in the first place?
I think a couple things. One is that I had phenomenal teachers. From elementary school. I still am in touch with a lot of those.
Nice.
And my kindergarten teacher and my high school English teacher came to my wedding a decade ago. I also had great teachers at the college level. For me, college humanities courses, but particularly religious studies courses, were places where you could ask really big questions. They were places where you read a lot and you wrote a lot, but it was also a place to open your mind to ideas you might never have been exposed to in high school and try on new kinds of thoughts that might not have been accepted in your home communities or sort of traditionally the norms of your high school environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so providing that kind of space for my students has been so important for me. And I've been at Clemson this is my 9th year. So I came in 2015 and writing through political upheavals of the last 8 years, pandemics, I've really seen that my students, many of them, are really hungry for a space where they can learn, where they can understand histories of the present moment they're in, and can provide ways of learning to talk to each other across lines of difference, not just with the assumption that they all hold the same religious or political views.
Yeah. And you have to believe that that is possible as a teacher. Like you have to like say this is possible. This dialogue between lines and across lines remains possible, and we must absolutely strive for our students to be able to do that. Otherwise, the future prospects become just so much more bleak. You just have to remain hopeful as a teacher that those barriers can you can go between them. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think that classrooms are a space where that happens. Probably often, in my experience, more often than places that are not classrooms,
Yeah.
right? Students get to read the same primary source material and engage with it. And so they're not talking about, what their personal views are. We're talking about what this historical figure's perspective was, and really pushing my students to expand their critical thinking skills, but at the same time to cultivate empathy for trying to understand people in the past, people of very different religious backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, racial, economic, gendered backgrounds. And from that, to try to put themselves in a place of wondering, sort of curiosity, why might someone have thought this? Or what might it have been like to go through life from their perspective or from this sort of membership in this community? And
Yeah.
I find that students are often really able to do that in a way that, those of us who aren't students anymore tend to be a little more stuck in our views. And so it can be harder for us to sort of have an opinion, encounter new evidence, and change our opinion. But 18 to 22-year-olds are often willing to do that pretty quickly.
Yeah. As I was reading your bio, something jumped out at me that you included in your bio specifically, and that's numerous teaching awards at Clemson. And I loved that because, as somebody who used to be on like a PhD program, like hopefully one day professor bound track, it seemed like the teaching was so minimized in the goal. And to me, it was only about the teaching, which made me realize that I was not on the correct path for myself personally. So I shifted gears about 11 years ago, and I don't have any regrets on that. But you have gotten a bunch of teaching awards at Clemson. Tell me a little bit about some of your favorite courses that you've taught there, and just kind of what stands out as some of your sort of like your personal triumphs, if you will.
Yeah. So thanks for noticing that. I mean, I think, I earned my PhD at Harvard, which was not a place that really taught me how to teach or valued teaching. It's great in lots of ways.
Yeah.
But I kind of had to teach myself how to teach by practicing teaching for my first couple of years at Clemson. And I have really come to see that teaching is a real art form. It takes a ton of work, but it also is so different often from the kind of scholarly production that we tend to do, which is sort of writing for 5 to 35 people in our field who might possibly care about this new niche of research.
Yeah.
And I do that. I like that. But for me, teaching is a great way of inviting people into a story, into a history that they didn't know about before. And so for me, I think triumphs in the classroom come from students who are willing to encounter new ideas and change their perspective. Um, I can think of a couple of examples from like past classrooms.
Yeah.
In the spring of 2016, which was, moving into some politically dicey territory in the US, there were student protests on my campus around the varieties of memorials to white supremacists, buildings named after them on campus,
Yeah.
and present failures to address the needs of Black faculty and students. These were undergraduate-led protests. And in the midst of that, I was teaching a course on religion in the American South, my first time teaching that course. And students in the course had very different views on these campus protests. And I had a white student say that she'd grown up in a small town not far from Clemson, that her family had only ever used the Confederate flag in ways that were not at all racist.
Hmm.
And African American students in the class responded to her, explaining how that flag, what that symbol meant to them, and talking about their own experience, right? It wasn't in a personal attack. It was more of, here's what that means to me. And I watched that student, it wasn't anything I was teaching, but to watch her listen to her peers, and she was actually listening to them. And then at the end of class, she was sort of reflecting back to her peers and said, it's really hard to think that the way you were raised, what your parents told you, might be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me was an amazing moment, because it wasn't my saying, here's the history, here's what the symbol means, go learn this. It was creating a space where students felt free first to voice their own opinions, but then also to respond to each other and say, whoa, 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 that is not my experience. Here's what it means to me. And then to have enough trust built up in the classroom where they're willing to do that.
Yeah. And then the acknowledgement of a person actively changing their own mind in public in front of their peers. What a powerful moment too.
It takes a lot of bravery to be willing to confront different ideas. And I think that I see that in other students. I mean, a lot of students at Clemson, maybe more so than a lot of other public universities of its size, tend to come from, and particularly the ones who self-select into religious studies courses, are often from conservative or evangelical Christian perspectives. And although our courses are engaged in the academic study of religion, students from those backgrounds are commonly there. And it's wonderful, right? I don't have to make the case that religion is still a thing that matters in the world today to a lot of my students at Clemson. But to watch students hear a history of their tradition or a history of the United States and its messy religious history that is often very different than what they've heard growing up. Often students have grown up not knowing the name of Jerry Falwell, but knowing a version of the moral majority rhetoric of the 80s, which was way before they were born, that would be a version of white Christian nationalism today, that America is a Christian nation and, sort of very partial version of history. And to watch them sit there in class and you see their faces where they're like, oh, this is not what I learned before. And then a lot of them are willing to say, I have a lot of questions, or this is hard for me. And I love office hours. Like that is my best domain, I think. I love the classroom too, but to have students come in and say, I have a question about the paper that's due in 2 weeks, but also I have this other question. And normally the other question is some version of this other person in my life, parent, religious leader, said this one thing, but in class we read this other thing. Can you help me understand the differences between these two?
Yeah.
And I love being able to suggest. I have a whole small bookshelf in my office. It's my lending library. It's not generally big scholarly texts. It's often more kind of public-facing type work of saying, okay, you're interested in this issue or that. Here is a book you might want to borrow. And I just keep notes, and sometimes the books wander off, but I figure that's for a good end too.
Yeah.
And to have a chance to help students grapple with the intersection between what they're reading in class and how that might relate to their life is really, really fascinating for me.
Yeah, that's a really delicate balance too, because you're asking students to question sometimes their entire life history and everything they've ever been told in the home. And so in a way, it's kind of like subversive, but it's not meant to be negative. Do you know what I mean? It's meant to help students just see a little bit broader of a view than what was possible to be taught to them within a certain context. Have you ever had any major pushbacks on these kinds of things? Because I feel like that would really rattle a lot of people, like students, but also possibly parents and families as well.
Yeah, I've never heard from angry parents. That could happen next week, but it hasn't happened to me yet. I do have students who push back, right? I have students who aren't sure this is what they want to be doing. And to them, what I try to say is that I'm not telling you my personal beliefs, right? That's not what we're doing this semester. We're trying to think about what other people have said over time. And, if you disagree with what you're reading, great. Come tell me your perspective. And let's think about how we craft arguments in this academic study of religion space. Where do we have historical data? What kinds of sources can we marshal for a different argument than the one you're seeing here? Disagree with what I'm presenting to you. That's great. But realize what you're disagreeing with. Is it you don't like what Thomas Jefferson did to the Bible because that is different than your perspective on the Bible? I've gotten a lot of pushback on that, where students seem to think that I'm defending Jefferson. And that was a great teaching moment for me, because I realized I needed to reteach the first few weeks of my course in a different way. If they got to Jefferson when we had, say, talked about Jonathan Edwards, and they didn't, or maybe they saw me supporting what he was saying, I was just trying to explain it. But I do try to always explain religious views. I had students ask me what Calvinism meant yesterday, or what is predestination for Puritans we were talking about. But to explain it in a way where members of a community who hold that view or engage in that practice, whatever it is, would recognize themselves in it. So not to explain it in a kind of cynical, pejorative way, but to say, well, here is what the idea is. And that way students don't feel made fun of for their view if I talk about, I don't know what their backgrounds are. But if I talk about something that's something they hold dear, I am not coming off as scoffing at it,
Right.
but rather saying, here was the view, and maybe here was a critique at the time of that view. And I tell students this is not because all ideas are equal. We read pro-slavery theology, for instance, in my courses. And I tell students I don't want us to be neutral on these subjects, but I want us to understand how the arguments were being made, because that helps us understand how the world we're in today came to be.
Yeah. It's so amazing that you're doing this work in a classroom for students, because if I think back on my own, early undergraduate years, these are some of the most impactful experiences that still linger with me, of, almost 2 decades after I was in college. Well, actually 2 decades. Yeah, it's been 20 years. And so I'm glad that you're doing these types of work, and you're also committed to doing these works for the greater public as well. I know that right now you are working with the Sacred Rights program, where you are engaging and seeking to expand your own visibility with regards to public scholarship. And I know that you're already doing things. I know that you've been on other podcasts. I know that you recently were on a panel called Facing History and Ourselves. And I'm wondering if you can just tell me a little bit about the experience of what public scholarship means to you at this point in your career, and just kind of see where that answer takes you. 'Cause I'm super curious about what public scholarship, why this matters to you so much right now.
One of the things that Liz Buchar says in the Sacred Rights training is that a lot of public scholarship is using your teacher voice in public.
Hmm.
And that really resonated with me because I know what my teacher voice sounds like. And so for me, being able to use that in public has been a way of saying, oh, I'm used to, engaging with people who don't have a great background in my area of expertise and helping walk them through what some of the key ideas are. I'm used to helping them understand why this might apply to the present. And so one of the things I've really been able to do with the help of the Sacred Rights training is to think about the language they often use is, being smart in public, right?
Yeah.
That if I'm just at an academic conference with, several dozen peers who are hearing a conference panel on something that we all know a lot about, I'm not creating as much new knowledge, or I'm not spreading as much new knowledge as I can speaking to a large, mainline Protestant congregation in my area, where folks, ranging from, younger adults, but especially those over the age of 60, who often didn't learn this kind of history in school and who are curious and a little bit hesitant that they might be told that what they learned was wrong and that there's something bad about it, but instead to invite them in to see why learning religious history, learning African American history, learning a different perspective than they might have seen before can actually be really life-giving. It can give you an expansive way of seeing the world. So speaking at the fundraiser for Facing History, which is an amazing secondary educational nonprofit, empowering teachers to teach topics like the civil rights movement or the Holocaust in their classrooms, giving students sort of an ethical education alongside their state required social studies curriculum. They're great at doing that kind of work. So it was really fun to get to speak about my own experience. I was once a seventh grader in one of those classrooms.
Amazing.
But then also to think about how to kind of sell the idea of history, right? Because I'm used to selling that idea. I tell my students in the first day of class, if you think this class is just going to be memorizing dates and facts, it's not. I never make my students memorize dates because they have such a negative reaction to it. I want them to think about the big questions. How and why? How did this come to be? Why did it come to be? How did this idea affect that, or this movement grow out of this other one? Why did these people think the way they did? That's what we need, I think, in our broader society today. I mean, right? We're at the start of another big election year.
Yeah.
And to think about how can we learn from each other's stories rather than just mine history for little facts that support our pet agenda, whatever it is.
Yeah.
We need to understand our full humanity and our big stories that shape our lives and others' lives so that we can begin to figure out anew what it would mean to live in community with the people who are our neighbors, who are our fellow citizens, fellow residents of whatever area we are in the US and of the US as a whole.
Yeah. It's something that like stands out to me is I always like to do activities in my own classrooms where we take something that we can see with our own eyes, like where we live, like why we live where we live in the cities that we live. So why do neighborhoods look the way that they look? And then you can trace those back through things like blockbusting and redlining and VA loans and FHA loans, and you can like trace the present back to certain cruxes and turning points in history that are related to policy and social views and all kinds of stuff. Like I love doing stuff like that where we take something that we can see out the window in the cities that we live in and then trace it back to its beginning. Like that's what I'm loving so much about what you're saying too.
Yeah, and I think we do that, and we can think of that in terms of religious history as well, right? Where did certain ideas come to be? What are actually quite new ideas? And then just by showing, I don't argue for the truth or the falsity of any religious view. That's not my job as a public university religious studies professor. But if I can show that a certain idea didn't exist 200 years ago and came into being since then, that itself can kind of shake students for whom that's an accepted idea. They say, wow, oh, that's new? That really reframes things. Or I had a student once reading, it was a text written by a Presbyterian Confederate veteran immediately after the Civil War, 2 years after the Civil War in 1867. It's called a Defense of Virginia and Through Her of the South. And it is basically a reprising of pro-slavery theology 2 years after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment. And I had the students read a piece of this. And when I walked into class, one student who was a freshman at the time from, again, a small town not far from Clemson, looked at me and he said, Dr. Jemison, this, pointing at the reading, this is the same as every argument against social justice that I have ever received from my conservative megachurch. And for him, the connection was immediate, right? The arguments for basically pro-slavery theology after emancipation, which I show as a sort of a form of white Christian citizenship in the post-emancipation period in my own scholarly work. This student reading one of the primary sources immediately got, oh, this is the same argument I've heard in my own 21st century life in a very different context, and yet not that different of a context.
Yeah. So in sacred rights, you get a lot of trainings and things like that. And when you do public scholarship, there has to be a point where rubber meets the road, right? You have to actually do the thing. You can get the trainings, you can get the ideas, but then you actually have to do stuff. What are some of your specific goals and realms that you find yourself dipping into because of maybe some new ideas and some new skills that you're kind of tapping into?
Yeah. So I think one of the things I've discovered, sacred rights is amazing. And for me, coming into sacred rights a year after I'd earned tenure opened up all kinds of new perspectives. Like one of the great things about sacred rights is that scholars are at all stages of their academic career and all types of employment in and around the academy. But for me, as someone who just earned tenure and was kind of thinking about what's next, the training was sort of like, oh, I see what's next. What's next is engaging more with the public. I do have a second scholarly book project, the sort of book to get you to be a full professor. But for me, that's not the urgent project. It's more of this work. And so I was fortunate enough to be invited. The invitation was sort of in the works as I started Sacred Rights to teach a 5-week course at a local, large, kind of moderate mainline, mostly white church in my area. And for me, using the Sacred Rights training, thinking about how to use my teaching voice in public, how to express what was most important, really helped me frame that course as something very different than just let me bring my sort of Harvard PhD to bear. I think not sounding like I have a PhD from Harvard is one of my assets.
Interesting.
Right. I know a lot. I can reference a lot of scholarship if people want to. But instead of saying, here is what this monograph said, and here's what the footnote is in the historiographical argument being made, instead saying, let me tell you about one person who lived 50 years ago or 200 years ago, and using a biographical framework, explore some big issues that person encountered and that shaped their life. It helped me think through the sort of speaking of the Facing History fundraiser because it was a different environment. That was several hundred people in an auditorium. And I was talking about this particular educational nonprofit. But the broader message was, let's learn our history and not be afraid of it because it's going to help us be in deeper community with those around us. And so I've been invited to an Episcopal church in a different city in the Southeast from where I live hosts a Lenten series. So During the season of Lent before Easter, around lunchtime, this is a church in a busy downtown, so people could come in on a lunch break. They have a variety of speakers. So it's not just ordained clergy. I'm not an ordained clergy person. But they have certainly Christian folks, but also a rabbi every year, at least one. And they have a variety of speakers who engage with questions of religion and public life. And so I'm going there and thinking also about how to think about history, religious history. This church is built on land that is just adjacent, sort of their parking lot was literally just adjacent to where enslaved people were bought and sold. It was seen as a slave auction site, in the antebellum period. And the church has been grappling with how can they note that? How can they recognize that? What does that mean? And so to help them think through, in the time that I'm at that congregation, how can I bring tools to bear on that process, right? I'm not a member of that congregation. I don't even live in their city, but I want to help think about how my training, how my teaching experience in my classroom, but also more broadly, can help give people frameworks for grappling with deeply dark and difficult and painful histories. To think about how white supremacy is not just a feature of the past, but is still part of our society today. And for other, particularly white Americans like myself, what might be an ethical form of engagement or a more ethical form of engagement around questions of history.
Yeah, and something that I really love about your work too is not only are you interested in public scholarship for like adults and people in the community, and not only are you interested in your own students, but you also are interested in what's going on in K-12. I read a piece of yours that you focused on Florida recently called Florida's New Curriculum Echoes the Paternalist Theology of the Lost Cause. And I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about your interest in K-12, because that's the world that I work in. And the world of standards and things like that is something that I have worked with for the last, 20 years. So I'm curious about your interest in K-12 because I'm in that world and you're in higher ed. And I just love to know like your experiences of working across these lines.
Yeah. So I think I would first say, I want to learn more from you. I know you know a whole lot more about these kind of educational standards than I do, and I'd love to, be educated by you on this. I think having seen the ways in which white Christians work to argue that white supremacist systems like segregation, like Black disenfranchisement in Jim Crow era Southern states, to argue that those were part of good Christian order, that they were good for folks. They weren't just expedient political measures, but they were things that Christians as Christians should support because, and they had a variety of reasons for this. I'm very attuned to the ways that people can use things like what children are taught or how we approach the teaching and understanding of history for very strategic and sometimes dangerous political ends. And so this past summer when, there was a lot of news coverage of these new Florida K through 12 standards, particularly the claim that in some cases, slavery could be beneficial to those who were enslaved. That was often the soundbite or the headline as people were criticizing this new curriculum. I thought, oh, I've seen things like this before. And so I went to go read the standards and to think about the ways in which they're shaping what teachers can and can't do. I mean, a group of students I often have, and I have inevitably like a quarter of my classroom or a third of my classroom when I teach the history of religion in the United States survey are history secondary ed education students. And so they're being trained to become history teachers. And so they often talk about what we're doing in the class could they teach in their future classroom? What would they not be allowed to teach? How are they going to grapple with this very kind of politicized and polarizing moment in American education at the K-12 level? So I'm attuned to it. I have students who want to go out and be teachers. And I just see how crucially important our K-12 educational system is. I mean, I'm a public school mom. I'm grateful for the public school education that my kids can get.
Yeah.
And so to think about the ways that those standards are shaping a certain narrative of history. And what I did in that piece, I argued, was that it wasn't just random, but it was a very similar set of arguments in that historical sort of curricular standards document that I had seen in things justifying segregation and white supremacy in the Jim Crow South, arguing that white people were the ones shaping African American history. So in the abolitionist curriculum, or the names mentioned to understand about Reconstruction, they're virtually all white, as though Abraham Lincoln ended slavery on his own. That's not true. That's not what happened historically. And to think about what it means, though, to take African American history and claim that it was done by white people. Right? What is the damage being done by that kind of thing? What does it mean to discount or choose not to teach about violence that people of color, but particularly African Americans, encountered? To frame things like the Tulsa Massacre as sort of both sides, or there was violence going two ways. Think, whoa, 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 whoa. That is not true to the historical record of what we know about that event. But that kind of claim, that kind of discussion of something as a riot that we might better understand as a massacre, those kinds of moments have been for more than a century, for, particularly for decades, from the end of the Reconstruction period well into the 20th century, those types of moments were written that way. And that was dangerous, right? That justified white supremacist violence because white people believed they were under attack and they were willing to claim that that was the case when it absolutely was false. And so it makes me very nervous to see that kind of rhetoric come back into official standards, right? We're in a different moment, fortunately, in the 21st century. But those arguments are coming back in ways that I think we should be aware of and in some cases alarmed by.
Yeah. And something that really stands out to me too is the difference between where you are and where I am. So I live in New York, and the standards in a place like New York versus the standards in a place like Florida, there's a lot of difference that exists in those. And so you can have kids in the same exact generation, the same age, with the same birth year and everything, growing up in just two separate parts of the country, several hundred miles apart. And they're just getting such vastly different views of our shared past. Does that make sense? I mean, it's kind of a disturbing thing because all it does is it makes our lives 10 years from now continue to be difficult. It just entrenches future challenges and the need to revisit this continuously forever. Like it feels like it will never end, this cycle.
Yeah, I mean, I live in South Carolina, and my county's public libraries, which is another site, not just K-12 education, but also the public libraries, have been basically under attack by a lot of their leaders looking to limit books about LGBTQ plus individuals or families, claiming books that the kinds of children's books that I read to my own children, that I often own, but also try to check out from our library, about a family with same-sex parents. They label that as pornography. I am not reading pornography to my children. But by claiming those kinds of things, you see the ways in which they're trying to get books out of libraries. And thus, they want to take certain people's experiences are allowed in public libraries and others are not. They've gotten so restrictive where library staff locally in my county are not allowed to put up, say, a Black History Month display or even a 4th of July patriotism display because the leadership is so upset about very appropriate pride displays they put up in the past. And so you see the ways in which it's absolutely K-12 education standards, but it's also, what do you see when you walk into your local public library? What kinds of experiences are valued? What kinds of people are told that their experiences are not valued, right? I think that is another area where I'm deeply concerned.
Yeah. Well, I love that you're paying so close attention, and I really do hope you keep writing about schools because as a parent who also has a kiddo in public schools, like this issue matters to me. As a teacher in K-12, it's awesome to see people in higher education caring about what's going on in the lives of students that are on the way to higher education institutions. Far more professors like you should care about this because our schools are directly feeding the students that are coming at you imminently. So it's so cool that you're doing that. I do want to chat a little bit about some of your future goals, just briefly within academia. You already have a book out called Christian Citizens, Reading the Bible in Black and White in the Post-Emancipation South, which came out in 2020. And you already have a podcast interview on New Books Network. And I love New Books Network. So if people want to hear you talk directly about that book, definitely go listen to that episode on New Books Network because they do amazing work over there. What I'm more curious about is what you're working on now. Tell me a little bit about your what readers can expect from your forthcoming volume that you're working on Christian motherhood. Go ahead and psych up the listeners.
Yeah, so I'm interested in thinking about moving a bit closer to the present in the next book. So rather than thinking entirely about the late 19th century, looking at how Southern women, along and often across racial lines in the sort of first 4 decades of the 20th century, were often at the forefront of what they would sometimes term interracial cooperation. These were very lopsided partnerships. Often the white women held a tremendous amount of power, but there were moments where organizing around seemingly shared ideas of Christian motherhood, Christian womanhood, could bring women together and help them recognize the humanity, the dignity of women, of opposing racial groups, of opposing denominational groups, and to see each other not as opponents, but as together, as shared sort of Christian mothers working together in a somewhat similar framework. This to help enable some white women to really organize against lynching, to say basically, don't do this in the name of white womanhood. I see the violence this is doing. And that's only because of the courage of African American women who would say directly to white women, you are responsible. Look what's being done in your name and look how destructive it is. I see other examples of times where white women were able to organize and say that African American schools needed to be improved, needed to be better funded. Now, they were not arguing that they needed to be equal or that they needed to be integrated. There are huge gaps in what these white women were doing, huge failings. But in their time period, to argue for better funding for schools, better pay for teachers, longer school years was really important work. And those white women were willing sometimes around these ideas of Christian motherhood and Christian womanhood to organize. And there were some tremendous African women who were incredibly brave to keep saying over and over again, no, you didn't hear us. Here's what we're advocating for. And often to go and do the work themselves when the white women were unwilling. Because Christian motherhood was not a panacea, did not solve everything. Sometimes it sort of allowed white women to get their own view sort of so loudly expressed that they did a lot of real kind of cultural and other violence because they assumed motherhood looked the same for the women whom they employed in their home as it did for them. And that was just impossible. There's no way that was the same. And so there are real limitations to this project, but it's looking for sort of kind of nascent seeds of what would become some forward movements for change during an era that we often see, rightly so, as a sort of low point for race relations, if people term it, or for white supremacist violence. And it's true that it's that too. But to look for moments, spaces where people went against the assumptions of their day, people who might give us kind of usable past or models for doing courageous work in our present.
So what are you enjoying about this project? What are you most excited about for this book? I'm curious, like what's got you pumped up about it and how you're finding the process so far.
I mean, I find the process, I love archive. I mean, I'm a nerd.
Yeah.
I love being in archives and in microfilm, and even as more things get digitized and I'm reading, things on a screen rather than actually being there with the box of papers. I really love thinking about how people change their perspectives, not unlike teaching, right? How did someone say, oh, I never thought of it from that perspective? Or here is a way, sometimes women would argue, here's a way that women are uniquely suited, better than the men in their communities, and the men, often the male clergy who are leading their denominations or their congregations, to say we are better suited to do this work, and here's why. And to see the ways that they did try to push for admittedly limited, but for real changes that needed to happen. And, people who were willing to change their mind. Often they wouldn't go as far as many of their interlocutors wanted them to go. There were real limitations here. But I get excited when I see people encountering new ideas and changing their perspective, whether that's in my classroom or in my archives. And so looking for that, I think is really fun because you find a lot of interesting stories along the way.
What's your timeline for the Christian motherhood book?
That's a great question. It has a few more years to go between, again, my teaching, parenting, and other responsibilities. I think I'm really leaning into public scholarship in this particular moment. And so the scholarly project can wait. It needs to happen. It will happen. But I think that finding ways to kind of hold all these projects in the air at once means more just sort of shifting between them. I think realistically, it's going to be a few more years before I have it out.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Elizabeth Jemison, I am so delighted by this conversation. It is awesome to, like I said earlier, see the ways that someone in higher education is caring so deeply about what's going on in schools, focusing on teaching, and really seeking to create a wide-ranging exposure to your work and what you care about at seemingly all levels within like your parenting, within your work in K-12, within your work at Clemson, and within your work in public events. You're hitting such a wide range, and it's so cool to see the variety of what you're doing. And I'm wondering if you have anything that you would like to promote, or if there are any places you would like to direct people's attention if they wanted to follow along with your work and what you got going on.
I would say, my faculty page is actually a place where there's a lot of, updated, I always have my updated CV up there and things like that. And I'm on LinkedIn as well. So LinkedIn is another space where I'm trying to kind of engage with folks across a wide variety of perspectives. And so just searching for me there is a great choice. And I would say that, also figure out what's in your own public library, what's going on in your own public, K-12 situation. Because it can't ever just be the parents or just the teachers in public schools who advocate for our public schools. We all need them. And it's part of, what public goods are meant to be, public libraries and the rest too.
Dr. Elizabeth Jemison, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you so much.